and welcome to today's Build Back Better conversation, where we're talking about green infrastructure. I'm delighted to introduce our guests. Fran, Sustainable Places Officer for Natural Resources Wales, Carwyn Davies, Director of Hacer Developments, Kate McCabe, Community Development Facilitator for Pobl Group, Andrew Collins, Regeneration and Economic Development Officer for Neath, Talbot, County Borough Council. I'm Zoe Antrobus, and over to our host, Dawn Lyle.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm looking forward to a good conversation today about green infrastructure. Everything we talk about For the Region is about how we build back better post-COVID and into the next few months and years. A big part of that is the major developments that are going on across our region, how we make sure they really are building for the future, the kind of communities and developments that we want to see across our region. And green infrastructure is a huge part of that. Fran, you are a real influencer in this space. What are we talking about when we say green infrastructure? What does it even mean?
So green infrastructure, I mean, it's a nice bit of jargon, isn't it? But it's really the term used to describe the natural features, particularly when we're talking about it in an urban context, so in our towns and cities, all of the natural things. But the infrastructure part of it is really taking that one step further from just thinking about greening and, nice things that are green, but thinking about its functionality. So, what does it do? Why is it there? Is it doing the right kind of job for us? We understand a highway takes a car from A to B. Are we making sure our street trees are good for our well-being, are good for managing our water quality, quantity, and providing space for biodiversity? And this is, obviously really important, not just because of climate change, but particularly because of the ecological emergency that we also face. The ecosystem services, which is another nice bit of jargon, but it's about thinking about making sure that our greening is doing a job.
The possibility with green infrastructure then is to solve a whole number of challenges and problems on new developments. And you mentioned well-being there. I know you've done lots of work with Swansea Council, looking at the city centre. I mean, what is your primary call to action? What would you love to see?
I suppose, we've got these sort of guiding principles where we want to make sure that we're working with nature, not against it, that it's smart, it's sustainable. And these are all kind of, buzzwords. What does that mean? But it's making sure it's the right tree in the right place for the right reasons. And that's, phenomenally important. The multifunctional approach, I bang on about multifunctionality all the time. And I guess if people could take one message from me, it's when you look at something green, ask the question, what does it do? And if we can't answer that, then I don't think we've really thought about it in, the right strategic sense, making sure that we've got the right greening in the right places. But it's not just more greening, it's clever greening.
I'd love you to make that practical. What's an example of, someone just doing green infrastructure just for the sake of it, that's not multi-solving? And what's an example then of how you might think about that differently?
The typical kind of verge planting that we see, which is often, you might get a bit of mode amenity grassland, or, someone might have stuck in a few tokenistic trees, but they've not really thought about what those trees do, or if they're the right tree in the right place. So we often find there are loads of tree examples where trees have been, the inappropriate tree have been put in the inappropriate place. And it's often used to drive the conversation of, well, we shouldn't put trees in our urban landscape because they cause us problems. Well, they do if we don't put them in the right way. And that, I think, is fundamental to us changing the conversation, is understanding what are the constraints and what are we trying to achieve. So thinking about what we're trying to get that tree to do before we pick a tree. No, we wouldn't have London plane trees in, probably lots of the places that we have them, causing some of the issues that we find. We might have different trees. But it's thinking about, what does it do? And having that as the beginning question before we start the design process. And then we wouldn't have amenity grassland kind of everywhere, which is expensive to mow. And we often don't let it get to a place where it flowers anyway. So it's not really doing anything from a functionality point. We might as well have just painted the ground green, although, that might not be very nice. But what I mean, getting more soil, more vegetation, more water into our urban landscape is kind of critical to making sure that this all works together.
And I think I'm right in saying that in Wales, there's legislation now around sustainable urban drainage. And so developers are having to think more. Is green infrastructure part of that conversation? Wales
is leading the way when it comes to the legislation around sustainable urban drainage. I mean, leading the way in the world. We're a global leader in terms of the fact that we've said, if you're over 100 square meters, you need to do this. But then translating that into practice, obviously, although this is not new, this has been around for 30 plus years, It's still very new to people doing it, particularly in our part of the world. And there's lots of lessons that we can learn from, but it's ensuring that the landscape or your development holds water, creates space for biodiversity, so creates space for nature, creates amenities, nice for people. It manages water quality and quantity. And particularly, obviously, I'm based in Swansea, but that's particularly important because all of the stuff that gets washed off our urban landscape when it rains, all of that stuff that goes into those drains gets washed into our rivers, washed into our bathing water, our beaches, and comes back to greet us in the sea when it comes upon a high tide. So it's really understanding that if we create a sponge, we turn our city into a sponge, holding water, using nature, and working with nature, not against it. Again, it's just all those opportunities that come. You can get it's a win-win. You can get so many things when you use green infrastructure as a way of managing water quality, water quantity, and creating biodiversity, space, and amenity. So it does a lot more than a highway slot drain.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks for introducing the topic and giving us a good context to start from. I'd like to bring in Carwyn. Carwyn is from Hacer, which is a fantastic regional developer working on a really exciting project in Swansea city centre, which is a biophilic building. Carwyn, thanks for joining us. What does biophilia mean? Tell us about your upcoming development, and what does green infrastructure mean to you?
The phrase biophilia was coined, I believe, by Edward Wilson in the 50s or 60s, or somebody may correct me on the date timeline. And it's basically about living closer and an appreciation of nature, okay? And I think when we first sort of approached regeneration, I suppose this sort of concept evolved through looking initially at how we would be part of the regeneration of the centre of Swansea. And we worked with, we were fortunate enough, we had good connections with Swansea University and some really good brains in that field. So we began to how do we regenerate our town? How do we meet the climate change issues that are so significant these days? And whenever I sort of speak about it, the first sort of the idea was to create community. So that's how it evolved to becoming biophilic, because people like nature, people like being close to it. Where do we go if we want to take the dog for a walk? We don't go to a multi-story car park, we go to the green fields and we walk around woodlands, don't we? So it's innate in all of us, the enjoyment of nature. Okay, so we very much saw the introduction of this kind of biophilic way of living as very much creating nature, creating a purpose, creating a reason, because people need to, we talk about loneliness as a big issue in society, and we talk about people not integrating, and this is sadly all too common in built up urban environments. And if we create a reason to share a space or to communicate, and that reason we feel is biophilic, is that nature aspect that can bring people together, and it really does improve well-being. And one of the sort of side kind of research projects we're doing on our project is that looking at the health benefits and hopefully providing a quantum of data which suggests that living in this kind of environment does benefit your health, and therefore has impacts on the costs of healthcare and what have you. So it's about creating an environment which then deals with the carbon absorption, which nature is an incredibly efficient tool that we've ignored for the last 50 years. Okay, and it's great to see we're starting to realise, hang on, she knew what she was doing all along, and nature has a lot of the answers. And I hope that what we're proposing and due to start in Swansea will be an exemplar and an example of what can be done.
So I've heard you talk before about the project, and I know you're benefiting from some Welsh Government funding to make it possible, because obviously being a pioneering kind of exemplar project, there are some extra costs and big investments that need to be made over and above what you might normally do if you were just converting a building into apartments in the normal way. What are some of the things that you're having to think about completely differently from other schemes that you've worked on in the past?
It basically, to go back to what Fran was saying, it's how we deal with water is a key consideration. Okay, so we've got in this scheme integrated blue roofs, green roofs. So what we do is slow the rate of water being dumped into the drainage systems and overloading and what have you. Okay, so there was a calculation done by Gary Grant. The amount of water coming off our building should be very minimal. We've got plant absorption, we've got the greenhouses, we've got areas where water is required absorbed to create growth in the plants and what have you. So very much it's been designed with minimizing its footprint and impact. There's obviously the benefits then by creating growth, plant growth, and that you've got absorption of carbon through that that process, the release of oxygen. So it's just creating that kind of circular system, which is there. It's always been there, and we're just picking it up. To go back to your point on Welsh governments, the support we've had from them, we wouldn't be able to do this without that, and that has to be admitted. It is a pilot, is an exemplar scheme that the IHP programme does let us really experiment with concepts and ideas, and got to really sort of congratulate Welsh government, and I hope they continue with the programme for many, many years to come, because if anything's going to set Wales apart, I believe, then it's that kind of level of innovation and funding that we can secure and really push the boundaries constantly. So big thanks. The issue we have obviously is it does cost money. Saving the planet, we may not like to hear it, is going to cost money. And I think we have to realise that the planet has sort of regressed, and bring it back, it's going to cost a lot more than the sort of standard, the status quo at present is. So that has to be taken for granted. How we deal with that is the challenge. How do we fund it? How is it driven forward? So there's ways of thinking around that as well, which is key. Many challenges, but if we don't start, if we don't give it a go, then certainly we won't sort of address this pressing issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point, and sort of an exemplar project helps to blaze a trail, and hopefully a lot of learning will come from your project that maybe then becomes more affordable over time for mainstream developers to incorporate. And I'm sure, Fran could probably point to some interventions in terms of green infrastructure on new developments that hopefully don't cost the earth, but as you say, it's making an investment.
And I think it's got to be affordable. And my ambition is that we through this scheme, we can reduce the capital costs and expenditures and decide this is key, that is key. So we get to a stage where it becomes more viable and accessible, and because it has to be made financially viable, or it won't be driven forward. If we have to have large amounts of government intervention for every scheme, then that's going to slow how we deal with climate change. Okay, so I think we've got to be creative in financial models, operational models, and I got some thoughts on possibly how we can look at that and how maybe monetize schemes with financiers and what have you. And these are the kind of ideas. It's not just always about the technology, it's about the financial, the operational as well.
Thank you for all your insight on that. I will give a quick plug because we've got another episode of this Build Back Better podcast where we've recorded a full conversation about that development in Swansea city centre, which includes an urban farm and a whole new model for how that development's being thought about and taken forward. So anyone that's interested to hear more from Carwyn about that scheme, please check out our dedicated interview all about that project. But for now, I'd like to move on and talk to Kate McCabe from Pobl. Pobl, as we know, is a registered social landlord building a number of communities right across our region. Kate, what does green infrastructure mean to you, and how are Pobl thinking differently about new developments and the integration of green spaces?
My role within Pobl, so I'm a community development facilitator, and a lot of my role is about linking our customers, the people that are living in our communities, the green infrastructure around where they live, and building on what both Fran and Carwyn have said is sort of looking at that, sort of having the right things in the right place, but also making sure that the communities are connected to those things as well, so that understanding of the multifunctionality that Fran talked about, and the right tree in the right place, and involving the community in those discussions. One of the areas that I'm focusing on is a large regeneration project that's been 3 or 4 years in the making in Penderry in Swansea. That's involved multiple partners in those conversations, looking at a regeneration plan, which is a vision for the next 15 years. And has included, in-depth conversations with the community about what they want to see and how they want to see things improved in their area, and looking at how we can connect people to those sorts of things. So the importance of nature connectedness within those communities, for people to value their green spaces. So we're not just looking at what can we do for nature and improving surface water drainage, but also how do we connect the people living in those communities to those green infrastructure spaces, and making the most of the green spaces within Penderry as well. So Penderry sits on the the edge of Swansea, and has got enormous amounts of green spaces and has been used by the community for different things over the years. And there are things that can be done in those areas that would improve the green infrastructure for nature and for the environment, but we need to make sure that we're doing that with the community. We're not just going in and doing it and then walking away and expecting it all to be looked after, but building on that sort of enthusiasm to improve the environment around where people live for themselves, for the future, and for their own well-being as well.
And so does that include things like community growing spaces for local food growing, or is it about green walls and green roofs? What sort of things are you incorporating in Penderry?
Bit of everything done, really. And we're taking the lead from the community, so we're looking at all the different options that could work in that place, and the sort of the things that those improvements could make in the area, but making sure that if the community are interested in taking those forward. So yeah, we're looking at how we could potentially develop community growing spaces, but making sure that there is a community to take that forward as well. We wouldn't want to go in and set up a community growing space and not have anybody to look after and maintain it going forward. Looking at lots of different aspects, but also looking at how we can plant orchards within the area that can be accessible to the community, but also will help with sort of absorbing some water, increasing pollinators in the area and that sort of thing as well. So it's looking at that multifunctionality that Fran was talking about. Me and Fran have had many conversations about this, okay, and I'm on the same mantra as Fran, right, looking at everything that we do and what does it do, and how many things can it do. So being able to give people a menu of options that will improve the green infrastructure within the area. The people that are living there get that choice, and they choose what they want to see there based on the knowledge of what that thing does.
Great, thanks, Kate. I would be interested to hear from you what you think, what your advice would be to a house builder that's perhaps, not necessarily a social housing developer, but a normal house builder. Are there things that you've learned in your scheme that you think more house builders could incorporate on what we'll just call kind of ordinary developments?
Yeah, I think we've talked and looked at sort of rain gardens and green roofs on outbuildings, green walls where they can be put in, using fruit bushes as hedgerows, things that have got lots of different benefits to it, and things that not just new house builders but everyone can incorporate into their own gardens as well, and not to be scared of it, but also ask for there's so much knowledge in Swansea about this stuff that people should be sort of just ask the question, and there's someone out there that would be able to provide that support.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for that. Andrew, I'd like to bring you in. As Regeneration and Economic Development Officer at Neath, Talbot County Borough Council, can you talk to us a bit about this from a local authority perspective? How perhaps your emphasis has shifted towards green infrastructure, whether that's a kind of climate emergency response, and what does it mean for things that the council's building, but also perhaps other developments that are coming through the planning process? What's changing, and what are your reflections on some of this?
Well, I think just to start off, green infrastructure is a buzzword that we're all using today, but of course it's nothing new. You go back to Victorian urban planners, and they recognise the importance of green infrastructure then. You only have to look at places like Victoria Gardens in Neath and the Talbot Memorial Park in Port Talbot, where they recognise the requirement for green spaces within the urban environment, and that's something that we're going to have to take forward with our town centres in the future, because quite honestly we don't really know where our town centres are going to end up after the pandemic. Obviously they're going to take a massive hit, and it's important for us therefore as a council to play our part in making sure that there is as an attractive place for people to visit and to work in and live in the future going forward. And green infrastructure is going to play a massive part in that. So we've done our bit recently in urban projects that we've been involved with in Port Talbot, for example, the Vibrant and Vibrant Places programme, which Carwyn and his company played a part in as well. We used that money to create green passages between residential areas and the town centres, and residential areas and places of work, turning brownfield sites into riverside walks. So, you know, we've done our bit in the past with Talbot, but I think going forward it's going to be even more crucial to us, the way that we treat our town centres in respect to green infrastructure. To that end, we've actually commissioned consultants in Talbot to take a critical look at our town centres and to give us advice and to recognise potential projects that we can bring forward as part of the green infrastructure programme. We're also doing our bit with regards to current regeneration projects as well. The Plaza Cinema, which you may or may not be familiar with. You certainly would be if you're from Talbot. It's an iconic Art Deco cinema that was listed, but had been derelict for many, many years. So we acquired it and we're turning it into a multicultural venue. We're retaining the Art Deco frontage, but we're demolishing the rest of it and rebuilding it. And we're putting a green roof on that new build, not only for ecological purposes, but as alluded to previously by some of the other speakers, it helps us very much with the sustainable urban drainage. It's a massive building on a very constrained site, and so we're putting essentially a wild meadow on the roof, which will act as an attenuation pond effectively for that development. So in programs where we're integrating green infrastructure, but you know, I can't overemphasize how important it's going to be in making our town centres attractive in the future. We've got to look at green rolling, as been alluded to. But one thing I'd like to progress in Neath Talbot certainly is pocket parks, for example. You know, if you visit London, you see them all over the city centre, and they're wonderful little oases and places of refuge and peace and quiet. And I think that, you know, we're going to have to think more cleverly about how we use our urban space. And I think pocket parks and other green areas are going to be crucial in, you know, making our town centres more peaceful and attractive for people who live there and visit there. And you know, it's going to have a massive positive effect, I think, on mental issues and also just, you know, making people happier and, you know, in a more pleasant and greener environment. So it's a time of transition for us, really, with the urban regeneration, and you know, it's sort of been enforced on us with the pandemic, if you like, but it's something that we can really use to our advantage, I think.
And are you finding that as projects come through kind of the planning process, there's an opportunity to talk to developers or perhaps those in the town centre who are seeking to improve their properties, to encourage new ways of thinking about some of this and make sure that the private sector is taking these lessons on board as well?
Yes, I think, you know, future developments are going to perhaps play a bigger role. I mean, you know, Carwyn and Kate will know that, you know, there has been a tendency, I think, in the past to, especially with urban residential developments, to try and cram as many units in as possible. And I think as a result, we've been driven down that road through economics. This has been the only way to really provide the residences required. But I think amenity space has sadly been neglected in recent years. I would like to think that, you know, we as a council, as planners, Carwyn as a developer, and Kate as an RSL, will sort of step back and think a lot more cleverly about how we can reduce the quantity that we put in onto our development sites, and you know, make them a bit greener, a bit more pleasant for people to live in.
Yeah, as you say, that amenity space can solve so many challenges and you know, multi-solve for urban drainage as well as well-being. I loved what you said there about pocket parks and how bits of previously kind of forgotten or disused bits of green or brownfield space in our town centres and in our communities can potentially be turned into little oases. Have you got advice for people in the community? Perhaps they live next to an area of land that they think they could make more of. I mean, what would you suggest? Is there advice within the local authority or support to do that sort of thing?
Well, I think once we've had this consultant's report back, then that will be a catalyst really for us to get the community involved. It's obviously going to involve a huge consultation process, with our residents, with our partners in the town centres, including the developers and the RSLs. And we're not going to do this unilaterally. We'll obviously involve as many stakeholders as possible. We don't have all the clever answers, and a lot of people out there in the community do, and so there will obviously be a big consultation process going forward, because we're not going to get it right on our own.
Can I come in? Is that all right? I was just wondering, do we have the skills and supply chains in our region to be able to fulfill our ambitions for green infrastructure?
It's developing, it's certainly, I would say, high quality multifunctional green infrastructure industry is in its embryonic stages. There are some people who've been doing green roofs for a while. I think we've got one based in the region. So I think it's early days, but certainly conversations I'm having, people are chomping at the bit to get into it, and it's how we ensure that they have that the quality of skills to make sure that what we're getting is actual green infrastructure and is the real thing and not green bling, I suppose, is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, and Carwyn, you mentioned that you were working with the university on your development. I wonder if the colleges are engaged in green infrastructure as well.
Yeah, I'm sort of a big believer in I think the future needs to be more localized. I think we need to look at the skills within our region, within the areas that we already live, and to skill up is a part of that training. I mean, we sort of have an in-house sort of policy almost, where if we can't find it local, then we go out to the wider field. Okay, so we're working with Swansea-based architects, Swansea-based engineers, we're working with Swansea University, we're working with primarily local people, and we do have a lot of skill and ability in the region. It sometimes does frustrate me when I think that people need to go outside and go to London, when, hang on, there are very good and capable people in our region already. Let's skill these people up. Let's make Swansea and South Wales and Wales into this country of expertise. There's a lot of expertise there sometimes which we don't realise is on our doorstep. And I'll be the first to admit, I've been sort of surprised by the skill set in Swansea University, for example. It's been a complete eye-opener. I've never worked with universities before, and they've really opened my eyes to this. So, local is good.
Yeah.
Andrew, did you want to come in?
Yeah, Neath Talbot College in Venice, they've recognised a requirement here, and they are launching a number of courses now which are focused on green construction and engineering. So they've recognised the need, and they are hopefully going to fill in some of the gaps there. So I'm sure other colleges will follow suit, but Mark and his team do tend to be pretty pioneering, so they're already out of the blocks with that one.
That's good to hear.
Really good to hear.
Yeah, fantastic opportunities for people starting their careers in the construction sector to look at some of these new avenues and all these new skills that will be needed. So yeah, that's a really important factor. Any final reflections from you, Fran? What would your advice be to anyone? Kate raised a really important point about how we can all do more of this in our own gardens and in our own communities. Final thoughts or advice from you?
So there was a point I wanted to pick up one of the things that Carwyn mentioned as well around cost, things being expensive up front, and it's a different type of cost when we think about construction because it's a cost we've not thought of before, but actually the long-term costs of not doing it are massive. So green infrastructure, when done properly, is much cheaper in the long term. So when we look at life cycle costs and we look at all the other stuff, obviously the reasons to do it are massive. But also from a point of, baby boomers collecting their pensions, pension-driven development kind of funding streams, they need to get a long-term rental income from their investments rather than a one-off payment. So they see unsustainable development it's not something they want to invest in. So the investment market is changing as well. So there are all sorts of other economic drivers. And then when we talk about, the dwell time in our towns and our urban centres, been so crucial to how we kind of probably get our way out of some of the damages that, the scars that we're going to be left with from COVID. We've got 5 principles that, anyone who manages, maintains, designs, builds, wants to vegetate and maintain green infrastructure. If you apply these principles, then we should see that we're enhancing the quality of the green infrastructure in our urban places particularly. And that's making sure it's multifunctional. I can't say that word enough. Adapted for climate change. This is about adapting and mitigating for climate change and making our spaces better for people and nature. Making sure it's healthy. So really thinking about how people actively travel through it. Is it good for well-being? It's biodiverse. Obviously, I mentioned the ecological emergency that we face, and smart and sustainable. And really, it's quite a simple package. But if your decisions around green infrastructure involve those principles, and all of them, if you consider all of them, then we should see the quality of green infrastructure, being, we're ensuring its quality. Because we know our cities and our urban centres, our towns, even, in villages, it's going to get dry, it's going to get hot, and then we're going to have big, massive amounts of rainfall. We're going to see surface flooding. And we know green infrastructure can alleviate for those things. One last thing that I would add is have lots of really good conversations. We want to have a kind of almost a community of practice around this. That as Carwyn alluded to, said it quite clearly. There's a lot of really good skills around our area. Having good conversations, asking lots of good questions, learning, understanding where each other's coming from. It's a real opportunity to do something quite spectacular in our region.
That is a really great message to end on, Fran. I think we really all want to see South West Wales leading the way in a lot of this stuff. And so anyone listening that wants advice or input, or just wants to have a discussion or connect up some new thinking on any of this, get in touch with us at For the Region. We can put you in touch with all of the people that we've spoken to today, and many more practitioners and experts across South West Wales who are really leading the way on all of this. And let's try and make sure that everything we're building and everything we're doing in our urban environments, but also in our rural areas, is solving for those things: biodiversity, adaptability to climate change, and multifunctionality. That's the word of the day. Thanks all for joining us. I think it's been a really useful conversation, and as you say, we're really keen to develop that community of practice and put green infrastructure on everybody's lips. So really appreciate all of your insight this afternoon, and we'll catch up with you all again soon. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this conversation from For the Region, another episode of Build Back Better. Please tune in again next week for another online conversation. Bye for now.